Bong.
People often say to me, Caleb, no, what they say is, how do you do those effects shots in your Star Wars edits? So I'm going to run through every single VFX shot that I did in Attack of the Clones. It's not like the right way to do things. I very much just tried to, get the ideas across as quick as possible. So I'll timestamp the key areas, the face replacements and sky replacements and the stuff that, people really want to know about, but otherwise I'm going to go through everything. Hi, it's me from the future. I have just gone through everything. I will be popping up from time to time to fix past Caleb's mistakes and explain things that he glossed over. Now, this is all in After Effects, but if you don't know After Effects, I think, don't worry, I'll try to sort of explain a lot of the key concepts as we go, which means that it will start off a little bit more tutorialized, but then become increasingly rapid fire. Once I'm done with this, I will start on doing Revenge of the Sith, but it turns out it actually takes quite a while to do this. So that'll probably be next week. That'll be out, and that will be for the website members. That will include 3D work and the paint outs and some of the more high-level stuff than what I got into on this. And broadly, I put a bit more polish into those shots. Good, that's a good bit of preamble. Let's jump in. Shot 1 and 2. This is not a good start. These come from when I first edited Attack of the Clones in, 2014-ish. And one of the things that I did at the time was a bit of relighting the shots with the lightsabers in them. And there's a couple of those that I thought were usable enough. So let's see what's going on here. Well, so the first thing to note is that this is 2 shots in one composition, which I probably wouldn't do now. No reason really not to, it's just messy. So, by itself, we have a very dark room not being illuminated by Anakin's lightsaber at all. So probably the way that I'd approach this now would be to take a still frame, take it into Photoshop, paint in all the detail as if there's a light source in the middle of this room, and then just reveal it in After Effects. And that is basically what I'm doing here, but it's just not quite as good of a result, and it's sort of a little bit more fiddly in After Effects. But I'll walk through it, because obviously it does the job. It does the job good enough that I didn't feel like I had to redo this shot, and it's probably a good introduction to some After Effects ideas, but it's definitely not like my recommended approach of how to do this shot. So the first thing that I'm doing is adding some light onto this wall behind R2 here. So I'm just filling this layer entirely with this blue color, and then masking out the area that I want, which is this wall, and the area that I don't want, which is R2-D2 and this adjoining wall. Basically just going in here and going, I want this wall, but I don't want R2, so I set that to subtract, and then doing the same for the wall, but better than that. I want to have this big soft glow on the wall, but then a hard cut off here, and I don't want it to affect R2-D2 too much. But then you'll notice my blue fill is also affecting like the bright areas. I really just want it to affect that back wall. And I'm doing this all on a copy of the footage, and the reason why I'm doing that, there's other ways to approach this, but the reason why I'm doing that here is so that I can do an extraction. I only want my fill to affect the darkest pixels, right? The pitch black areas on that back wall. So I can do an extraction and limit it to just those black areas. Without that, it's going to be opaque over everything, but with that on, it's going to cut out anything that isn't like the darkest areas in this image. And then I'm animating the opacity to sort of fade on as Anakin comes past. Just like going like this, keyframing at 0%, keyframing at like 50%, and then coming back down a bit for the end of the shot. And then finally, I've just done a bit of noise. Now, noise is a really incredible effect for compositing. It's not crucial here, but it does help in a couple of key ways. The first is, I'm just filling this layer, right? Which isn't necessarily the best way to do this, but I'm just filling this with this blue color. So there's now no texture in it. and there's no noise in it. So I can add back that noise. The first thing that it's going to do is help this to blend with the noisy areas around it. And the second thing is it's just going to give it a little bit of texture, as if there is some detail to the wall back there. Now this arch repair, you can see I've just taken this arch and then just duplicated it down here. And the way that I've done that is by taking a copy of the layer again, and I'm flipping it upside down. And the reason I'm flipping it is so that these highlights, which are coming from this window over here, are on the inside, as if they're coming from this lightsaber over here. I'm masking out actually where the arch is, right? And then I've got these boxes at the top and bottom, and they're just there to fade it out slowly, so it sort of just blends in with the areas around it. But then, because it is just a flipped copy, right, it's actually going to be kicking out in this direction. So the last thing I've done is just a mesh wall, and I just added a bunch of columns until I got this sort of line that nicely sat around my arch, and just bended it back into place. Next up, we've got light and shadows, which looks like the same sort of thing that I did for that wall behind R2 there. I'm extracting the bottom so it's not like that Star Trek thing of putting Vaseline on the camera lens, right? You keep those high details while I can still fill the bottom with this block color, and then just add noise to add in some detail. And then to reveal that layer, I'm using this black solid matte. So I actually have a black layer, I've got all my masks on, and I'm just animating them on, and then I'm using the opacity of this layer, so these areas that are black, not checkerboarded, to drive the opacity of this light and shadows layer, which has my fill on it, and I'm setting that to use this black solid as an alpha matte. So it's basically the same as just drawing the masks on this layer, but the benefit is it's a bit more flexible. There's no need for me to do it here. You could do something like add a bit of atmosphere to it, but give it a bit of life, or like adjust the overall opacity of it. And then I'm taking another copy of the footage and I'm just setting it to add, and I'm using that same matte again. I'm just going in and adding some smaller little details as well. And you can see this is actually doing a lot of the heavy lifting here, adding in those highlights. And this is the quickest and cheekiest way to relight a scene, just with an additive layer. And again, I am just doing a little bit of an extraction, but not as extreme of an extraction, right? In this case, I still actually do want to affect those brighter areas. I just don't want to completely overexpose the highlights. Now, this shot has just a tiny bit of movement. You can see it's slightly shifting down. Looks like it maybe is a 2D move that they added in post to give the shot some life. And the great thing about working with duplicates of the footage is that we don't have to worry about that movement. All of our duplicates are just going to stack on top of each other perfectly, except for the arch repair. The arch repair is actually a freeze frame, so if I don't do anything about that, you can see it's actually just sort of going to hover in the frame. So I have had to motion track this footage. I've taken this base layer, I've just put a track point on an area with a bit of detail, and tracked forwards and backwards, and that just gives me the position information of what that camera movement is. I apply that to this null object, so back in our composition we have this little red box that is moving in the correct position. So then I can parent this arch repair to that null, and that's just going to make sure that it sticks in place. It's not perfect, it is still floating around a little bit. We could go and touch it up, or we could do a different type of motion tracking, which I'm sure we will get into, but I'm not going to worry about right now, and obviously I didn't worry about back then either. It's pretty cheap and hacky, but there you go. It's not a bad way of adding a bit of light. So that's technically all of shot 1, and definitely if you compare this to this, it does at least kind of look like the lightsaber is lighting up the room. Now, shot 1.5. Again, I'm not thrilled about this. This is just sort of imported from my original edit that no one will ever see. I guess the one thing to note is this shadow back here. I'm actually adding a little bit of haloing around around the lightsaber. Which, the way I'm doing that is just taking a still frame where Anakin is not visible and just painting that over top of the original, tracking it in place to match the slight camera movement that's going on here. And that just lets me reveal the shadow. Again, not the way I do it now, but kind of, serviceable enough. I also did this down here, which I'm not that thrilled about. You can see these. I'd probably actually just delete those. That looks dumb. Okay, let's move on. Shot 2. I believe I've not kept any of my changes to this, but obviously I was very interested in adding a little bit more lighting to her face, and I did a lot of experiments with that, but ultimately you just can't do it. You just can't add back detail where there was none originally without actually painting in those dark areas where there is no detail, which is exactly what I do now. Probably you do that AI assisted like I did for the Emperor's chin in Revenge of the Sith, just to bring back those shadows. So there we go. I very cleverly have actually not made any changes to that shot at all. Moving on. Shot 4. 4? Yeah, whatever. Who cares? This is a good one. This is one to look at. There's a lot going on here actually. So the original shot would be something like this, which is actually entirely different. So first, I am retiming Anakin's performance to get that where I want it to be. So I'm using a time remap, and I put a keyframe at the start, I put a keyframe at the end, and then I swap them. So it's reversed, and then I'm just going in, manually adding these keyframes between to sort of make it look a little natural. This would be a smart thing to do in the graph editor, but here I have just done it with linear keyframes and just spacing them out. But then, because I'm squashing and stretching the footage, there isn't actually a frame that lands exactly on every frame. So by default, After Effects is just going to use the nearest frame, which is not what we want, because that means that it's going to have all this stuttering in it. So we can toggle the frame blending mode to fade between each one, which gets you this look, which is sometimes handy and doesn't take too long to render, but we want to switch it to optical flow or morphing, so it generates a frame in between each frame. And After Effects' frame interpolation is not incredible. Actually, I don't know if they've updated it recently. It might be better now, but there are better options. But obviously this lets me do it all in After Effects, and it's good enough. You can't really tell that there is an interpolated frame. Now the only problem here is those eyes are very wonky. Reversed eyes never look good. Turns out you actually in real life spend a lot longer on the way up blinking. So there you go. So it always looks wonky. So the first thing I've done is bring back those eyes a frame early. This is just the eyes from this frame pasted back on top of this frame. I'm actually also bringing back in the eyelids. Look at this monstrosity. And sort of animating the eyelids manually to open. It looks very rough. Probably spend a little bit more time on this. Add back those eyelashes might help. But it does just sort of make it look like a little bit more of a natural movement. Compare this, where they snap open, to this, which just adds a little bit of a smoothness. Now, the other thing that I want is I don't want Obi-Wan to actually be looking at Anakin while this is happening. I'm kind of turning this shot into a completely new shot that has Anakin glaring at Obi-Wan, but Obi-Wan being ambivalent. So the way I've done that very simply is I've grabbed the bit of Obi-Wan's performance that I want, which is him looking ahead while Anakin yells at him, looking ahead nonplussed while Anakin yells at him, and I've just masked it. You can see I'm just masking around the edge of Anakin's shoulder here and loosely around his face. But actually, in motion, you can see that moving around a bit if you're focused on it, but it's pretty good, really. It's good enough. Again, if I was going to spend more time on this, that'd be definitely the first thing to clean up. But it's close enough. Shot 5. I guess the first thing to note here is that I actually used a 2K rip of the movie to do my edit. So occasionally when I did really need to get into sort of high detail work in my effects shots, I worked on that original 4K scan, and you can see here I've scaled it back to 50%. So I'm adding this lightsaber that's flying out of his hand. It's actually very simply done, very roughly done. You can see to start with, it doesn't exist at all, and then I'm just doing a few things. So I'm starting by doing a 2D track on the footage here, and I'm doing that in Mocha, which is a planar tracker. So it's really good for tracking surfaces that have a lot of detail within them, but you know, they don't warp, and it's basically just a really good way of getting a 2D track that is going to be a lot more reliable than what you get out of the default After Effects camera tracker. So I'm just drawing a mask around that ship, tracking it forwards, tracking it backwards, and we can see that it is warping around a little bit, but I'm not too worried. That's close enough. The only thing I'm adding here is the lightsaber, and I'm going to have to do manual positioning of that anyway, so if it's wiggling around a bit, you know, I'm not too worried. But definitely, if I was adding any more than just the lightsaber into this shot, I would be in trouble. So I take that, I save that back into After Effects, and it gives me all of these keyframes, which look like this, and that's great, but that's not what I want. I want to export the transform information to a null object so that I can parent the lightsaber to that null, which is moving around, and then I have my 3D lightsaber. So I just use Element 3D for the lightsaber from Video Copilot, and actually there Luke's lightsaber model, and for the environment I'm just using this HDRI of Chinatown because it sort of matched the colors close enough that you know, it kind of worked. And then I'm just animating the position of this single element manually, and I'm just moving it up and moving the rotation back, moving it back in Z space, and it's just on this 2D layer that's being tracked to the camera move. So it looks like it's all 3D, but it's actually really, you know, very much 2.5D. I also wanted it to be identifiable as a lightsaber while it's down here, and by default, with the motion that I had on it, it was actually moving a little too fast to really see the detail. So I've actually done something a little hacky here, and I've turned the shutter angle down, so it's only having half the motion blur on it that it technically should have. And then once it starts to fly away, I'm cranking that right up to 180 so it looks natural. And then I actually have two motion blurs for this. I have the Element 3D motion blur, and then I also have the motion blur of the 2D layer moving around in relation to that track. A little weird to mix and match them like this, but I think it does the job. And I've tweaked a ton of settings here to give it the nice ambient occlusion, the fog as it fades into the background, all of that stuff. And finally, a little bit of a box blur to match the sharpness of the foreground. Actually, it's a little softer than the foreground, but there you go. And a curves adjustment, so that it's dark when it's down here in his hand, and then as it goes back here, it brightens up and flies away. So animating between that curve and that curve. And then finally, I just need to make sure that it's sitting behind his hand. So again, I'm using a layer as a mask, a track matte, and masking out his hand. probably starting from around here and working my way forwards and backwards. And this camera that's sitting on the top here is just so that I can control the depth of field. I don't think it's doing anything else. That's basically it. Pretty rough, but it actually matches into the shots around it pretty much spot on. You know, it's not too hard to match 2002 level visual effects. Shot 7. Now this is a classic bit of compositing, bit of fun. I just want to add this explosion into the cockpit. Now in the movie originally there was this explosion, bang, but I obviously wanted to do something a little bit more, because rather than him just cutting through the glass, I actually wanted him to destroy the speeder at this point. So let's go into this comp that's called Explosion Effects. Right, okay, yeah, I'm just roughly layering up all the effects that I want, setting them to the right blend mode so they stack on top of each other nicely. Start with some dirt, always good. These are all just action essentials. Why use anything else? It's good enough. Fire at cam, you rarely get to use that. A charge, and another charge. And all together, bang. Pretty good. Now all of that has to be tracked into place, because obviously there's this camera movement. I'm tracking that based on the edge of this speeder here, because obviously that's the physical set piece that the camera is actually moving in relation to. I'm just tracking the bit that I need, which is this last, like, I don't know, 10 frames or whatever. And then again, I just need to do some masking of these windows so it doesn't show up anywhere else. And then finally, because I want this to be more of an extreme shot, I'm adding this fake camera move. I'm adding a position, rotation, scale, just to punch in and sort of zoom around. This blue outline represents the original frame, and you can see I'm just sort of moving that around so that when we do cut into the next shot, you know, it's a bit more seamless because we have this turning movement. Alright, shot 10, a face replacement. Let's open it up. So I've marked out the areas between the start and the end of what I want to replace. Might have brought that in from Premiere. So the very first thing to do is to just track the face movement, the whole head movement. Now a planar tracker is not a very good way to track a surface that moves as much as a face does. It's really good for solid objects that all of the details within them stay exactly the same, but the object moves. And particularly selecting a face like this is not the way to go if you want to do it. There are tools for doing this sort of tracking. I think in Mocha Pro they have a tool to do that, and you could use the plugin Lockdown, but throughout this edit I'm just using Mocha, and later on I do use it a lot better than this, but broadly I think this does work for this shot. Then I'm taking a freeze frame of his face at this point, and I'm sticking it back on top, just the mouth, and I'm parenting that to the movement that we grabbed from that track. So now this still of his mouth is moving in relation to where his face was. But that's not enough, because once we get to the end, it's going to weirdly snap out. It's not going to look very nice. So I also need to take a freeze frame of his face at this point and then track that going in the opposite direction. If my tracks were better, I wouldn't have to track it in both directions, but because you know, I'm not doing an incredible job here, and I'm not even really using the right tool for the job here, I've had to do two tracks and just sort of marry them up in the middle. And then to blend the two, I've just got the opacity of the top one fading. So it literally just fades on over the original. And everything combined, that gives us the full effect of this. Now, there is tidying up to do, and we can do some liquefying to make that sort of look a little bit more natural, but this is definitely over the line. That entire line read has just been removed. So it's actually a pretty simple effect to do. You just have to freeze a frame, cut it out, and track it on. Obviously it doesn't work if there's extreme 3D movements, though we'll maybe get to some of that. Alright, so shot 12. This is another face replacement and a retime, and actually quite a bit. I'm basically condensing an entire little dialogue into one line. So, let's dig in here. Let's start with this face replacement. So that's the original shot. All I want to do is just stop her from talking. So the first thing to note is that the lighting is changing quite a bit. She starts in the light area here and walks into the dark. So that's going to cause some problems. We can't just freeze frame a frame at the start and have that carry on throughout. We're going to need to figure out a way to transition her from the light into the dark, which obviously I have done. So again, I've done all my motion tracking in Mocha, and again, because there's sort of too much movement on a face for Mocha to handle, I'm doing one track that goes from the end to the beginning, and another track that goes from the beginning forward, and then I'm going to merge them in the middle. So that's all the face movement, separated up into 2 tracks. So the first thing I've done is grabbed a freeze frame of her face at the start, and then I'm masking that out and fading it off so it kind of matches the way that the light wrapped around her face in the original shot. And I'm actually making use of that original footage because there's a lot of areas of her face that are fine to keep as is. The movement of her eyes, her cheeks. I just need to get rid of that mouth movement. So even as I fade into these other freeze frames, they are missing sections of the face. There's no need to replace the nose when the nose has plenty of good lighting on it. I just need to remove the areas that are making it obvious that she's talking. I need to add back her neck to obviously stop the movement of the chin, and finally faded that into that final freeze frame. So altogether we get this. It's a little wonky, but it's close enough. Okay, so let's move up into the parent comp. So I've got my face replacement here, but I want to merge it with the end of the original take. I want to take this bit where she's standing there still, looking gormless, and add her sort of walking up, looking gormless. Because I want to have her walk up, and then while she's walking, Django is saying his line, then he hands her the bugs, end of scene. Which means I'm cutting out a lot, and I want to merge basically the 2 ends of this shot. So I just want to take my retimed performance, the start of the shot, and just stack that back on top and just mask it out. So I'm both masking over the Zam from the original shot and adding in the Zam that I want to add. And I have to animate those masks, which we'll get back to, and it is tracked into place. So the first problem with that is the colors are different. At this point in the shot, everything's quite blue, and then as we get later in the shot, they become a lot greener. So I'm just doing a curves adjustment, going from this little bit of a green kick, just to basically match those edges. You know, it's maybe a little on the green side on her face in that, but at least you don't notice any hard disconnect between those edges, and then just fading that off. And then once she finishes this move and she is where she finally ends up being, I want to fade back to the original footage. But I don't want there to be an obvious cut point or a fade point or somewhere where you could obviously see her sort of snapping back into place. So what I want to do is I want to basically make a custom morph cut. I don't want to fade between these 2 shots. I want them to merge into each other. So what I'm doing is I'm actually masking areas of this off over time so that there isn't a clear cut point. The cutting between the shots happens in little areas at different points in time, wiping areas off. But then secondly, and far more importantly, I'm doing a liquefy. I'm just going to set my opacity to half or whatever, and then just start using these liquefy tools to sort of pull the areas of her face back into place. As well as opacity, a good way to line it up is to use the difference blend mode. And difference is going to turn any areas that match black. As I pull these areas around, they're either going to get lighter as they get further away or darker as they get closer together. I think it's good to use both opacity and difference. Sometimes difference, you end up making things looking weird to the eye, even if they pixel perfectly line up. Whereas opacity, you are just working off what looks best to your eye. But both very useful ways of lining up two shots. And I think I've actually just improved that a fair bit. So without liquefy and with liquefy. And the great thing about liquefy is you also get this distortion percentage. So I can actually fade that up over time. So it is a little weird. It does have that look of morphing. If you really look at it, you can see her sort of warping back into place. But it is a nice way of merging two takes without ever having a single obvious cut point. Then finally, because I'm just sort of roughly masking this layer back on top, I do have a slight little problem in that this one little speeder appears out of nowhere and just goes behind her head there. So I'm just grabbing this bottom layer, putting it back on top, and masking that little bit out. There we go. One seamless shot, finished. But I'm not done. I then want to add a little bit of a zoom out, actually. And there's a slight dolly in on this shot in the first place, so it gives me, vertigo effect, dolly zoom. So it's slightly pushing in and zooming out, so it's like sort of looking kind of cool and ominous. So that's just animating the position and scale. Now I'm zoomed in quite a bit, and obviously I'm working off 4K rip of the movie, but we do start to lose some detail. So I want to bring back that detail, and the way I'm doing that is just with a sharpen effect. Now the only problem with that is, no matter what resolution you use, this movie was shot on digital, and you're gonna get some digital artifacting in the dark areas. So I'm extracting the darkest areas of the image and using that as an alpha inverted matte for my sharpening. So wherever the picture is darkest, it's not going to sharpen. As opposed to if I turn that on, you see we get all of this awful blocky compression, and then if I turn that off, we're just sharpening those brighter areas, sharpening around these highlights, the areas that actually look good sharpened, just to sort of make it look a little higher res. And I'm fading that sharpening off as it zooms out, but just while I'm punched in so far, I want to make it look a little bit crisper. So there we go. That's that shot. A bit of a bodge, but pretty effective, I think. And definitely, I don't know, I think that all works. Okay, shot 13. This is actually just a pretty simple wipe transition. I'm not having to generate any new frames. It's literally just a linear wipe with a 200 pixel feather just wiping down. I'm sure we'll see more of these. Okay, moving on. Shot 14. I'm removing the line of Anakin's Jedi Don't Have Nightmares. So it's a face replacement, and also because I'm replacing this line with a pause, I'm actually trimming the shot down. So you see I've got this cut here, just so it's not a completely unnaturally long pause. So I have to do a face replacement and then also blend between these two shots. So let's jump into this comp. So first I'm doing my motion tracking, which we can see here. Just loosely planar track around his face, and then I'm applying that information to a null, so we get the position, scale, rotation, and then just doing my freeze frames of the face at the start, and another face further in, and just parenting those to that track information. So you can see we quite nicely blend through these two, and it just gives it a little bit of life and also matches you know, his face at around this point. So we fade out of it pretty much seamlessly. The only thing is, underneath his chin here, obviously his chin in the original shot was extending lower, so I've just very hackily extended my mask down, but obviously you would go in and repaint those curtains just to clean that up. But otherwise, that's that face replacement. Very quick, very simple. So obviously this lines up perfectly with the end of the first shot, and then I want to blend out into the second shot, which it lines up pretty good. I think the only problem here is Padmé's face. So again, I'm doing a liquefy just to pull her face up very roughly, and that will allow me to just fade between those two, you know, relatively smoothly. So there's a couple of things that are a little iffy here, but basically we get rid of that line and, you know, it does the job. Shot 15. So this shot is from one of those deleted scenes that I added back in, which is very noticeably lower resolution and also non-final visual effects, which I haven't really worried too much about. These scenes are just obviously lower resolution. There's nothing that you're going to do that really genuinely fixes that. You could make everything look all blobby with some machine learning upscaling, but you know, you're not really going to fix this. The one thing that I do want to fix is I'm fading from this into another shot that takes place in space. So I don't want you to fade from this with this terrible star field that's just like 12 dots into a shot that actually looks really nice. So basically I just want to add some stars in. Turns out that's really hard to do. So I'm using a few techniques, and we'll start from the start. So at the start of this shot, I was actually able to do a 3D camera track of like some of the details on the surface of Coruscant here and get a 3D camera. So this is just the After Effects 3D camera tracker. It's automatic. I have had to go into the settings and I've set it to variable zoom and tripod pan because that is the type of shot that this is. The zoom is changing, and as far as I can tell, the camera is just rotating. There's actually no 3D movement of the camera. It's just rotating in place. And that works pretty well. You can see we've got all of these lovely track points on the surface of the planet here. But once we get to this point, the motion blur starts getting a little bit too intense for it. It starts to lose them. And once we get to here, it suddenly decides that the ship is the only thing that it can track. We can go in and delete those, but it is just gonna freak out and never pull a good track basically past this point. As you can see, deleting those tracking points from the ship means that it thinks there is some insane rolling camera move here, which there is not. So let's add those back, and you can see at this point it decides that these are good things for tracking, which is a problem because they are all moving independently. So I only get the 3D camera track, you know, up until halfway, but that's okay. That's still useful. So these stars in the background to begin with, and this is one way of doing it, which is not incredible, but it's okay. I'm making a particle field of just 2D planes that are all facing the camera and spreading them really far back in 3D space. Just 12,000 2D planes pushed really far back and mapped onto a sphere. And then obviously as we pan the camera around, that matches up pretty nice. And I'm revealing those behind the layer by just extracting the black pixels out of that deleted scene footage. But the problem is, I lose the track. I lose the track about halfway in. So I kind of cheated here. Once you get a lot of motion blur on stars or whatever, they do start to fade. So I actually just faded them out entirely about here. So there isn't anything happening here. Or there is very, very faintly. But because it doesn't match perfectly, I'm fading it out so they basically, you know, disappear. And then for the second half of the shot, because obviously this is the important part that I want to transition out of, I've manually tracked stars in the background with null op, and each of these nulls is parented to each other. So the first one goes, tracks this star, and it moves away, and then I lose track of that star, so I move on to my next null, and I track this star right the way back till I lose that, and then I move on to the next null, and I track this star all the way back. And then roughly just throw another point back over here, so I get a little bit of motion blur on the way in if I needed some extra lead-in time. So I can basically parent to this bottom null here, and it will take all of the movement of all three of those. So what I've done is a fractal noise. If you do a fractal noise and you just crank up the contrast like extremely, so it's just white and black areas, and then you move the brightness right down, you can get it to just be these tiny little spots. And then we can turn the scale down really small, and suddenly we're getting a star field. And I generated it rather than using an image because I need all of this space, and you know, it's just a quick little thing. So that basically gets me this star field moving in, and it looks, you know, pretty good. And then, you know, this is just sitting behind this layer that's got the black cut out of it as well. And that all fits together pretty nicely. I really just couldn't solve this shot, so I just had to sort of mix it up and do it manually. So there we go. That's 2 ways to add a little star field. Okay, shot 16. I want to generate a shot of them both sort of shifting uncomfortably, and then also have it cut into the next shot of Padme turning away and saying, I can't, or whatever she says. So I've just isolated Anakin here, and I've done a time remap. So he sort of like goes forward to speak and then moves back. And that's got morphing between all those frames, and it's a little rough, but you know, he definitely isn't the focal point of this shot, so I think I get away with it without doing too much more. Something to consider would be doing some actual face replacement, maybe liquefying his performance a bit so it doesn't match exactly, and really getting in and smoothing out these keyframes rather than just having them all linear. You know, go into the curves editor and really make that look nice. But, you know, this achieves the effect of stopping him from speaking and having him look a little awkward with very little work. So then for Padme, the shot that already exists is basically exactly what I want, just without Anakin's performance. But basically, I want Padme to start speaking at the end of this shot. I want to cut from here immediately into her starting her next line. Like a bit of a J cut, so the dialogue actually starts like right here. So obviously her mouth isn't moving, her face isn't moving like she's going to speak, she's just sort of continuing to shift. So the way that I achieve that is with a liquefy effect. You can see I'm basically warping the mouth open and warping the face up, stretching it like it does when you start to speak, to give it a little bit of that movement. And then I'm just keyframing the distortion percentage, go up and then sort of down a bit and up, so it's like she's intake of breath and starting to speak. And the way I decided how to morph that was by looking at the shot that I wanted to cut into. So I'm cutting on the frame after this. So you can see I just want her to sort of breathe and move her mouth up. So I'm just animating my distortion to sort of match that. So she sort of breathes and moves her mouth open. So before, she's not speaking at all. Now she's about to speak. It's, you know, just a hacky way of achieving it. You can't push this too far, but definitely just gives the implication that we're going into that next shot. So all together, they just sort of shift awkwardly, and Padme starts the next line of dialogue. So that's a bit of fun.
I can't.
Shot 17. I'm taking that same idea and pushing it too far. I'm removing this shot and replacing it with this shot and keeping the audio. So I'm doing a liquefy to sort of move her mouth into the open position, so match the face like that, and then moving the percentage in time with the dialogue, which again I have visual reference of. I just match up the sort of mouth movement as best I can with that. I'm removing this little shaking head bit, but you know, the dialogue of when she's moving her mouth is matched up. And I've actually matched it up for longer than I need. And then I want to actually cut from this into this at like this point, right? I want to cut from here into here without any liquefying or anything. You know, it's going to look very jarring, like it doesn't belong at all, but I want to sort of smooth it out so it looks like it maybe kind of belongs. So I start with the liquefy so that her mouth is at least doing the right thing, and that's matched further down so I could figure out where I actually wanted to do that cut within this comp. And then I'm doing a mesh warp, and this is pretty rough, but basically I've subdivided it until I get this line going down her face here, and then I can sort of just slightly give it a bit of like a look of 3D rotation. So all of that together gives me that, which, you know, is a bit rough, but it definitely allows me to do that cut. Whereas if I have no effects on this layer, it's just going to cut out of that, bang, and it looks, you know, very jarring because there's no indication that she's starting to turn her head, and then all of a sudden she's turning her head. So the downside is I have this one frame here which looks a little weird, but the upside is that transition is pretty forgivable.
I can't. We can't. It's just not possible.
So, shot 18. Padme says her line, and Anakin stands up and says some bullshit. So, obviously I just want to remove this line. So, as always, I just start with a motion track of his face, the general movement of his head there. And I stick on a still frame that I have grabbed from the very end, which is interesting. And I'm just fading that on while he's sort of standing up here. There's enough motion blur to kind of cover up my crimes. I've turned this layer to have motion blur on, so you know, you're gonna have a hard time telling that there's actually a blend happening here. You know, it just looks like a motion blurred face. And then my track information, while it was okay, he sort of moves his head around quite a bit while he's speaking, so I have had to do just a little bit of tweaking to get it to not sort of be too obviously him talking. And to help remove all of that nodding, I've added a couple more layers of freeze framed heads. I've taken this as a freeze frame, and then I've taken this face as a freeze frame, and I'm just sort of blending those on just to sort of reduce the amount of nodding that's happening there. So altogether, his face replacement looks like that. You know, there's a little bit of extra movement in it. You know, it sort of blends on the motion blur, all that. It's kind of, you can almost see it when you're looking for it, but you know, it's pretty close. Now, the one other thing that I did want to do, just to help sort of calm him down, have him back off a bit, was remove this hand. And the way I did this was very hacky. I just did a track of this area of the couch, as we can see here. And I took a still frame of the couch with quite a bit of feather on it, and I just had that sit over top. So you can actually see in the final shot, his hand there, it sort of fades away into nothing. There are nicer ways to do that. Obviously you could tidy up that edge pretty quickly, but this does the job. He just sort of stands up and hovers, and that's all I want. Okay, so shot 19. This is another deleted scenes shot, and all I want to do here is just delay Anakin's line read by just a tiny bit. So all I'm doing is a time remap on this layer, literally just keyframing to draw out this pause and turning the frame blending on so it all blends smoothly. Also, as with every single shot in this movie, there is just a tiny little bit of movement that I just need to track out of that to make that sit nicely back on top. And the only thing that I have done on these deleted scenes to sort of improve their look, other than color grading, which I have done, that's not in here, I did all my color grading in Premiere, is just add a bit of sharpness. You know, I'm upscaling these slightly, and I just want to add back, you know, just a little bit of sharpness. It kind of, it doesn't make it look incredible, but it does make it look a little bit higher fidelity, and maybe it matches it in a tiny bit better with the rest of the movie without necessarily, you know, you don't lose any detail. It doesn't really create like nasty edges or anything. It's just a tiny little bit of a kick that you probably can't even see in this comparison. Let's really zoom in. A tiny bit of a kick that just brings back some of that detail. Shot 20. This is another one from when I first edited Attack of the Clones back in the day. But there's some fun stuff in here actually. So the first thing is this layer that's set to add, that I'm just doing all of these masks, moving them around, you know, turning the opacity on, all of that, and it's just adding that glow. A couple of effects on here, an extraction, so I'm not overexposing the brightest areas, and then a hue saturation, which is set to colorize everything blue, and then a curves adjustment just to brighten it up. So without those, we sort of brighten up everything, but it gets a little bit orange, and with that on, we are adding this blue glow. It's kind of close, but not incredible. I would definitely approach this slightly differently now. Again, that's the hackiest, cheapest way to do a bit of relighting, but it works. And then I also did, my memory is that this is okay, I added this little reflection of the lightsaber on this stool here, which is just hand masked out areas of where I thought the reflection should be. Very soft masks on white solids. And the bottom one just has a blue glow on it, which gives it that sort of look. And then the second one is just filled with a lighter blue color, and it's set to add, just to sort of add some specular highlight. But it actually doesn't look bad. Now, in the original shot, they've done some weird stuff. They've got this one frame where it connects and it all turns orange, and they've done like cutouts around everyone. You know, it's basically what you would do to relight it. It's just kind of weird color-wise. And then that flicks off, and they've got like this, the lightsaber glow is not looking very nice in this shot, and then as it fades away and it shuts off, we get down to just this one little tiny bit of glow, and then it shuts off entirely. And that little circle of glow is still hanging out there. Like they forgot to turn it off completely. So I've gone back in with an adjustment layer, just set to bring back the saturation and remove the blue and reintroduce the contrast. So, you know, within this circle, we get rid of that mistake. And then finally, for that one kind of weird shot, I have just shifted Obi-Wan over to blue. I don't know why I've used the change to color. I think probably a nicer way to do it is within hue saturation, or even just bring this frame into Photoshop and paint over it. But there we go. So that's that shot with a little extra lighting and tidied up a bit. Shot 21. Now there's quite a lot going on here. The original shot looks like this with this wipe transition. So I need to do an entire, day for sunset, and then also add this wipe back on top. So to start, I'm just going to slightly color grade my footage to, get me in the area, get me in the mood for working on some sunset effects. Then I didn't like this shadow. The shadow of this little fucking kangaroo guy, whatever they are. It's too obviously coming from off to the side here, like a sun is way back over there, shining down on that. So I have just grabbed a freeze frame of some sand and just moved it over top of that shadow. The rest of the shadows I think are okay. These could be reasonably it's kind of plausible that these shadows could be coming from a sun that's like back behind them, right? They seem to be coming towards us, whereas that shadow was going off to the left. And this, as with basically everything else, has to be tracked into place. There's a slight bit of camera movement on this, just tiny, but I did have to do a track of the whole frame, and basically every element that I'm adding over top of this footage is tracked into place by parenting it to that track. And the reason there are two nulls is because, again, sometimes I'm working with the 2K footage and scaling it down. So I have the actual track of the actual footage, and then I have a scaled down version, which is taking the tracking information from this null and just halving it. So next up, I have my sunset. This is basically done, right? I've just grabbed a piece of royalty-free stock footage. I probably ordinarily wouldn't do something that's so obviously like clipping and digital, but obviously that's something that happens quite a bit in Attack of the Clones, so it works, and I am just doing a little bit of color grading on this. Take out those blues, desaturate it just a tiny bit, and then give it a bit of blur. And the blur is important because I don't want this background to be sharper than anything in the foreground. And that's something that a lot of the compositing on Attack of the Clones missed. The backgrounds are often sharper than the foreground, so it's a very simple thing to do. Just chuck like a 1 pixel radius box blur on it, and it's all good. I'm masking it so that it like ends before the horizon, blends into the original footage just a little better, which maybe looks a little worse right now, but we'll get to that. And then I am just starting to add back some of those details into the sky by just doing an extraction on the original footage and creating a matte of those areas that are obviously too dark to be sky. Obviously I have to add back all of these things properly, but that just gets me a bit of a start. So I want to add back the vaporators, and the way I'm doing that is basically the same as this little rough overlay down there, but just more specific. So I'm doing a mask around where all the vaporators are, and then doing just a very fine extraction. We can look here, just those vaporators, and then blurring that matte, and then using this to control the opacity of this layer. That isolates all of those and lets me stack them all back on top. So without that and with that. And then I want to do the same for the base of the ship. Now, because the ship has obvious edges, I can just draw a mask around that. And by this point, I've managed to add back in all these tiny details with my mattes down beneath it. but I just want to get the body of this ship back in place. And I want to do a curves adjustment on it. I don't want it to be this color. I want it to be a little more matte. I want it to be like it's reflecting this sort of dirtier, more sunsetty, ground. There's a little bit of green in this ground now, and I want to have that represented in the bottom of the ship. You can see this is very high contrast, as if this is being lit by, full sunlight, whereas this is lower contrast and it's closer to what I'm eventually going for here. Then I'm doing the same for the top of the ship, and similarly stacking up some color corrections. So the reflections from the ground should have more green in them. The reflections from the sky should obviously have more yellow in them. So I'm just sort of adding in some vibrance and doing another curves adjustment to bring in those colors. And then I played around a lot with how to do the second sun, Tatooine's second sun. There's obviously, it shows up a bit in this movie, and it kind of, it never looks natural. It's not like a sun. So what I ended up doing is just taking a still from the end of Revenge of the Sith, which is this sun. And then just to sort of blend that in a little nicer, I've got this generated gradient ramp that I'm adding over top, sort of give it a little bit more glow, and I'm compositing even the sun back on top with a bit of add. So now it's sort of glowing back there. Now, the horizon line is obviously black, but I want it to sort of be a, dusty, sunsetty glow. So I'm just taking a couple copies of the original footage, the base footage, doing a mask around the horizon line, and another mask to make it sort of fade as it gets away from the center, stacking on an extraction, so I'm just extracting that line, blurring it out significantly, and then really, really brightening it up with curves and saturation, and setting that all to add. So you can see we get this sort of glowing, dusty line. And then I'm doing another copy of that, similar settings, but just tighter around that line, and we kind of get rid of that blackness. So now there's kind of a glow off the horizon coming from that sunset. Then I want to add sort of some flares coming from that sun. Obviously there should be glow. That sun is obviously hitting the camera lens, overexposing it. It should have some sort of glow around it. So I have just used a couple copies of optical flares with a curves adjustment on them. Now the optical flares are not doing a lot. You wouldn't have to use optical flares for this. These are just basically, point lights. You could use a gradient ramp and a curves adjustment and basically get that effect. And one of them is tinted more orange, and one is more white. But basically, it's just adding this sort of glow. So even though when I started it looks very contrasty, by the time I get up to here, I've kind of blown it out and it's all looking quite flat again. So now I want to do my grading, and I've done this in After Effects since I'm just doing this grade for the sky replacement shots, and I'm not doing it in a very complex way. I'm just like using, curves and saturation. So first I want to make everything just a bit more orange. So I'm going to tint it. I'm going to tint everything till it's basically black and white. There's a little bit of color difference, but it's basically black and white. And then do a curves adjustment to make these, dark and light areas look about right where they should be. If I was doing like, a monotone orange look. And then I've dialed the opacity of that back to 28%. So it's just adding just a little bit of a sort of orange overlay. Now I want to make all of this darker. It's looking quite white and washed out, and I want to bring those colors down. So again, I'm tinting to get rid of some of that saturation, though it wouldn't look out of place in Attack of the Clones. It does look a little nicer to not be so saturated. And then doing a curves adjustment to bring those colors down and add in a little color contrast as well. The only problem is it's now looking incredibly monotone. It is looking just orange. And if you look at footage of sunsets, often you have this very nice blue fall off. So I've cut out the middle of this layer so the center isn't really being affected, but as you get away and towards the edges, I have a curves adjustment to turn these edges blue, and just a tint to remove the saturation that I've introduced through doing this curves adjustment. And then finally I have to deal with this wipe. The way I'm going to do this, just very simply, I'm going to grab the original footage, stick it back on top, and then just chase ahead of the wipe by like 1 frame. So if the wipe is back here, then my wipe is over here. And I just race ahead of it by 1 frame all the way to the end, and then shifted this over by a frame, and it just allows me to transition that on while basically being exactly the same shot. Shot 22. Now, doing that one day for sunset means that basically every shot in this scene I need to change. So again, I'm just taking the original footage and doing a curves adjustment on it, the exact same curves adjustment, to make those colors, you know, a little closer to sunset. And then I'm adding back in that exact same sky element. Now I can kind of get the windows automatically selected, like the sky automatically selected just with an extraction, but there are some areas where I have to go in and just mask them out manually, and then I've done a bit of a blur to make that all soft, and altogether that lets me just replace that sky element a little so it just matches into that other shot just slightly more, but I'm not going crazy with it. And this is just set to soft light. A screen brings that up to be too bright, normal, and it doesn't blend at all, and overlay is sort of too contrasty for the shot, but soft light just lets it kind of sit in there and look, you know, it's just slightly supplementing the existing sky. And then I'm doing that exact same matte and just using that for an adjustment layer. Just a curves adjustment to bring that sky, again, the same curves adjustment from before, just for that sky. And then the last element here is this Obi-Wan hologram. Now, after I've done all my adjustments, obviously it's all affecting the hologram as well. So the way that I've handled this is, as always, rough but, you know, good enough. I've done just a simple mask around it, a feathered mask. If you really cared, you would go in and actually mask, you know, every frame of this properly and exactly, but I've just done a feathered mask of the original footage, and I'm sticking that back on top, and then I'm setting that to the color blend mode. So that lets this, you know, sort of match the new contrast of the scene while keeping that blue hologram color. And then finally I'm just using that one orange overlay over everything just to make it all, you know, a bit more sunsetty. Shot 24, so this is another wipe, pretty basic. The original shot here has a wipe on it that I'm just matching and racing ahead of just slightly, and then wiping to this shot, which I'm extending by just taking this frame here and freezing it. So this is all just a freeze frame, and then once the wipe gets close enough to this bike, I go back into the original shot, and all together, boom. Obviously, that's not how you would do this wipe if you had an option. You wouldn't hide the moving object behind the wipe, but, you know, my focus here is just getting a wipe that works, and that's it. If I can get that happening, I'm happy. Shot 25 is just a face replacement of Padme, and this is pretty rough, but you know, as always, motion tracking the face. I've done one track for the entire shot, freeze framing at this point, tracking that on, fading that off, going to another freeze frame here, tracking that on, fading that off, and one more down here just to fill in the chin. And then just like some manual position adjustments after the track to fit that all into place. There's plenty of tidying up you could do with a bit of distorting, a bit more like full face replacement, removing these head movements of hers, tidying up around the edges, blending these into each other a little better. But you know, the thing is, tidying these shots up would take you a couple of hours, which is longer than it took me to put them together in the first place. So yeah, it's something to do. There's room to improve here, but I was able to successfully remove a line read, and that's the main thing. Shot 26. This is another shot where I'm removing a line by cutting it out. So I want to go from this to this seamlessly without doing what's currently happening. So I've got my two shots that I'm cutting between, and I've zoomed in a little and lined them up so that the backgrounds match. So I just fade between the backgrounds and they match up fine. So I'm taking a copy of this first half, this layer here, and I'm masking out Anakin. As always, I'm just liquefying to pull him back into place. So he lines up with where I want to cut to, and just fading between the two with a little bit of position movement to help sell that. I mean, with liquefying, you can always spend a lot longer getting everything correct. His ear moves a little there. You can go in and tidy that up, but basically it lets me do a morph cut that isn't too obvious. And then for all these screens, I'm taking a copy of the bottom layer at this point and stretching that backwards, and then masking out each piece individually and faded them at different times, so it wasn't like obvious that there was a single cut point. Okay, so shot 27. There's a bit going on here, but let's start at the bottom. So this is basically one of those shots that I've kind of constructed out of nothing. None of these pieces originally belong here. Some of the pieces you end up seeing twice in my edit, but hopefully combining them in this way, you sort of don't see that. So at the bottom here, I just want to get Obi-Wan's performance. So I want him to sort of shift awkwardly, a little slower than he does in the movie, and then sort of stutter at the end, right? So he sort of shifts forwards and then back. So just to slightly exaggerate that awkward movement. I don't want Anakin to be saying any dialogue here. I just want this bit of him sort of breathing awkwardly, like, oh god. So that's just another time remap, going forwards, slowing to the middle, and then bouncing backwards. So he sort of breathes in and then out. I think I based the breathing movement, I shot just like on my phone, just footage of me doing that motion, and then sort of line that up vaguely, just using the time remap. And then finally, just so that it doesn't look like it's exactly bouncing back and forward, give it a bit more life, I am liquefying it. So you can see he sort of like looks a little bit more pleading at the end. So his eyebrows move up, his mouth moves down, you know, really just gives it a little bit of variance. And then finally, I'm not thrilled about this, but I needed to transition into the end of this shot. I needed to transition to this point where Padme is facing like the other direction. So I don't love what I've done here, but first I'm going to remove this Padme. So I'm just going to do a gradient ramp to fill in the wall color, you know, just using the exact gradient of that wall to fill it in. And then I'm adding Obi-Wan's arm back on top here, and that's pretty wonky, juddering around like that. But, you know, it is going to be partly covered by Padme, so it should be alright. And then I'm adding this shot. I'm flipping it, I'm reversing it in time, and I'm sticking it over top of this. So she starts facing in this direction and then turns towards us. and I'm just doing an extraction, curves, hue saturation, feathering, and a box blur to sort of make her sit more in the foreground, you know, give her that depth of field. And then I'm filling in these areas that weren't caught by the extraction with just a really rough mask. So, I mean, it's very, very rough, but hopefully you're not looking over here, you're looking over here at this guy, and maybe over here. And all of this is scaled up, and I'm zooming in. You can see the original shot is originally quite a lot wider, so I am scaling up and then doing just a little bit of sharpening just to bring back some of those details. Not a ton of sharpening, just a little bit, so it doesn't look too obviously out of place. Actually, I think I'm really happy with what's going on in the background, but it would be a lot more work to get that foreground actually looking nice. Shot 29, and this actually comes before the last one. So at the bottom here, I am taking Obi-Wan's awkward performance and just slowing that down at the end. I'm dividing it up into two halves. I have him sort of looking away in this shot, and then when we punch in, I have him coming back and shuffling awkwardly. So slowing his performance, incidentally slowing Padme's performance, but it doesn't really matter. Then I want to add Anakin's performance, and this is a rare occasion where I'm using that as is. Now, the only problem with this, as you can see, is that we've got a bunch of random overlapping happening between these two. I've just introduced this over top with just a very loose mask, 104 pixel radius, so it's a very smooth transition, but we've got this entire disaster happening here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is a gradient ramp that's just going to fill in this middle area, just roughly with the wall texture. So I've got one large mask at the top for the broad strokes, and then a smaller mask at the bottom to do this sort of detail work on Anakin's arm here and tighten that up. So then I'm taking a still frame of Obi-Wan's arm at this point where it's fully visible, right, freezing that frame, masking around it like exactly, and then just manually animating the position, rotation, and scale so it vaguely sits in place. It's chattering around a little bit, but you know, not too much for me to worry about really. But that's not all, because this is not just going to sit behind Anakin's arm there, right? So I need to do another layer on the very top of this, which is again masked roughly, done an extraction to separate the blue wall out, done a choker to improve that, and then a Gaussian blur just to soften that up. And I'm using that layer just sitting on top. Shot 30, back in the mood for some Day for Sunset color correction. So again, just copying those adjustments over, the base adjustment and then this orange overlay, sticking those back on top. I've done that in After Effects rather than Premiere so that I do the exact same color correction all in one place. Shot 31, same as before, color correction on the bottom, masking out the windows, extracting the rest, choking it, adding a blur, using that as a matte. You really do not have to do these mattes using the effects. Obviously, if I could be bothered to, I could just mask all of it exactly, but I just found it easier to do a extraction first off, and then just go over the areas that were missing. That's absolutely not a necessary step for a sky replacement. And in this case, the original sky was looking pretty grey, so I found I was better to just overlay it entirely. And finally, just popping that color overlay back on top. And the one thing to note that I actually haven't mentioned is this sunset is actually a time lapse that I've just slowed down, you know, basically to a halt. You can see it's just very slowly moving, and I've got that to the optical flow frame interpolation, so it's just blending between those time-lapse frames very slowly, which is a nice little cheat if you're wanting to do a sky. But there we go. another sky replacement done. So simple. So simple. Shot 32, curves adjustment, overlay, and in the middle here I have my hologram cut out, set to color, and I've also added the original set to the normal blend mode, but just with a half opacity on it, just because I guess that contrast was looking a little too much. Right, so shot 34. I've drawn out a lot of the scene, removed a lot of the dialogue, added a lot of pauses, and one of the problems is Padme is coming and going throughout. It was getting a little bit ridiculous how many trips she was making, and I wanted to cut to a reaction shot of her. So I just needed to paint her out, which was a little bit more of a pain than you would think because of this motion. So I've just done a freeze frame here at this point, and then I've tracked that to the movement of the original footage. And then finally, because we're extending a little beyond the edges here, the problem is this area over here where I'm actually revealing Padme walking over. So I'm just going to motion tile to extend out that edge in that direction. Shot 35, just a simple transition. I want to take this top shot, which is a linear wipe away from Yoda, and I want to put this radial wipe on top of it. So to stop this footage over here from interfering, I've just got that bouncing back before it gets to halfway, and then at the bottom, this is where that radial wipe comes from, this shot. So I need to get rid of all of this area and keep this slice for revealing. So I have just done a freeze frame that I've very roughly just slapped on top there, and done a radial wipe on that matches the radial wipe on the original footage to give us a sort of clean plate. There's a little bit of movement in it. This edge isn't very nice. Probably should put a choker on that actually to push that edge over, but anyway. And then also matching the radial wipe on this footage of Yoda. So altogether, shot 36. Another transition, just a diagonal wipe. Now the way I've done this is with a mask, actually. So this original footage here, this is where the diagonal wipe comes from, and then just animated a mask to follow that. I would have animated it like actually on the frame, on the line, and then I've moved it back over by a couple of frames. And with that set to subtract, I'm removing all of this area. And then in the background here, it's just slowed down a little so I make the most of every spare second that I have. It's a little bit weird because there is this traffic in the background. If you watch those shadows, they kind of go slow for a second. Ultimately, the simplest thing is just to slow it down a little bit, and you don't even notice. Shot 37. This is an embarrassing disaster. Maybe let's not talk about this. Well, so obviously I'm having to reconstruct the background, but I've got these guys walking off into the distance, so I've just tried to sort of continue that motion a little bit, but there's only so far that you can push that, and I'm comping back in traffic in the background and all of this ridiculous stuff. And it just kind of looks bad. A fun thing is I'm just matching the transition on this shot just by doing a circle mask that's centered in the frame and then just animating the expansion of it out. But let's not talk about this shot. Shot 38. Pretty simple, just doing a iris wipe on this shot. I am actually using the iris wipe effect. Just to match this iris wipe again. Looks like I'm feathering that a bit much, but whatever. And then in this background here, again, just slowing it down at the start to give myself that extra little bit of footage. Shot 39. Another transition. Obviously a transition from the deleted scene into this scene. Actually looked at a few ways to do this, but I think this has happened before in Star Wars where it transitions from space to space and they did it with a fade. So that's what I've done. I've done a fade. It's a little bit weird. There's just these two dots. But obviously this was why it was so important to bring back those stars in my deleted scene comp. So in here, I'm basically doing the same as before, doing a 3D track, which I've incredibly managed to automatically pull off nothing. So I'm doing Element 3D with those 2D planes thrown back in a sphere in 3D space, and there's two groups of them, two layers of like 30,000, 40,000 particles at all random sizes. They're all very bright with a Gaussian blur on them, and then they sort of animate to be smaller and sharper at the very end, I guess, as if there's like a zoom into them as we blend into this shot, which obviously has much nicer looking stars. Now to sit that behind the ship, I'm doing just this extraction again, extracting the black areas of that and putting them behind there. But the problem is there's actually black areas that I do want to remain black in this shot. I mean, they shouldn't be black, but just because this is from the deleted scenes footage, it's a little too high contrast, and there's some areas that end up being perfectly black. So I've done a bit of masking on just a copy of that layer on top of those black areas. So there are these nice clean areas where there's the implication that there's something masking out those stars, and it actually makes it look a lot better than it really should. If we look at the original here, it's looking pretty dumb and doughy, but once you add that stars, it actually does give everything a little bit more definition. And then for this transition, I'm just doing this fade, which is just literally keyframing the opacity down. And I actually didn't have quite enough footage there, so I have had to do a time remap to slow it down and ultimately freeze frame it here before it completely fades away. Then beneath that, I have this footage that I'm transitioning into, which originally comes from this shot. So I'm just masking out the area that I don't want. And then I need to reconstruct the star field on this side. So I've just taken a freeze frame of that star field at the end, and then I'm moving it around to match exactly the movement of this version. Well, I say exactly, it's a little bit rough, but you know, just close enough, doing it by eye, matching that in. And because I'm subtracting this transition anyway, that just all fits together quite nicely. The only thing is I do just miss a little bit of detail at the edges here, so I just have a copy of the layer with no movement on it. I could have done a motion tile, I could have done anything, but I just have a copy sitting at the bottom there. So altogether, we get that pretty reasonable fade. Shot 40, so I've just got this retimed performance of Padme's going into a wipe transition. So the retiming, I'm just slowing this down as we get to the end. I am actually slowing everything, so like in the background here, everyone slows down with a little bit of a bounce at the end, but ultimately there's a lot of movement here. You should be looking at the eyes, not at the background, and we've also got this wipe transition coming on, which will distract from that incredibly. So yeah, just a bit of retiming to make that look of hers be a bit more intense. And on the top here, this is just another one of these cases where I am chasing an existing wipe. Shot 41. This is the same sort of thing. I'm taking this bit from the deleted scenes, slowing that down, making that look more meaningful, and also wiping. The time remapping is pretty straightforward. The transition, I'm pretty cheekily just using this transition that I made before and just using that as an alpha matte for this deleted scenes layer. And then at the bottom, I'm revealing this footage here. So I need to reconstruct a clean plate of the stars here, which is pretty straightforward. Again, I'm just taking a freeze frame of the stars at this point and giving them a bit of movement. And here I'm using a motion tile to just extend those edges out. So that freeze frame cuts into the start of this shot perfectly. Pretty straightforward stuff. Shot 42, another transition. I'm slowing this performance down anyway, so this basically ends in a freeze frame, and then the layer beneath it just has a little bit of a transition. I've just moved a little earlier, so I basically just don't have to worry about that transition. So I'm slowing down the exit from this scene and speeding up the entrance to this scene, and on the plus side, it means that I don't have to do any reconstruction of any shots. Shot 43, I'm just chasing this wipe on this footage and just slowing down the background. Shot 44, I'm just reusing one of those wipes that I made before, one for this transition, on this footage, which is just slowing down, and I'm just cutting out of this scene earlier than it cut originally, so I don't need to worry about doing anything fancy there. Shot 45, I'm chasing a wipe on this top footage here, that's the original transition, and then on the bottom here some of this is originally obscured behind this wipe, so I'm reconstructing that just with a freeze frame, which is a little bit rough, but you know, okay enough. And I'm also continuing this camera move so that it zooms continuously by just parenting both of those together to this null object and then animating the position and scale on that. So it's not perfect because the actual camera move was moving in 3D space and I can only move in 2D space, which is why you can see that wipe moving across, but it's kind of obscured by this wipe going across it. Anyway, you can see if you really focus in here, you can see that sort of bounce around slightly. So there is tidying up that you could do, manually going in and distorting it all back into place, but who cares? Shot 46, I'm just chasing a wipe on this top layer, chasing that wipe, and on the bottom layer, I'm just slowing it down. Shot 47, I'm matching that wipe and then flipping it upside down. How interesting. And then they both have some time remapping on them, just to make sure that I don't see any of the original transitions. So you can see Obi-Wan sort of starts to freeze frame there, and they have a slight pause before they start walking, but it's pretty close. Shot 48, reusing that same wipe again. Pretty straightforward stuff. Actually, one thing that's interesting to look at here, this is the sort of thing that I was talking about earlier, these moons and like this camp, it's all sharper than like the foreground or like any other elements in the scene. So that's just early digital effects for you. It's not quite composited perfectly. Shot 49. On top here, a very simple wipe, nothing to worry about there, but then the bottom is slightly reconstructed. I think this originally has a wipe transition on it, so I'm freeze framing this side since we're not really going to see any movement on that side, and then I'm taking Yoda and I'm doing a little bit of time remapping on him just to have him shuffle around a little bit in the background there. So we keep Yoda's movement there, and we get to transition without having to do any reconstruction. Shot 50, another wipe, but a little bit more going on here. On the top, I am chasing that transition, but on the bottom, the original footage actually has this wipe coming down from the top, and I want to change it to a wipe going from the side. So I have to do a little bit of reconstruction here. First, freeze framing the background before that wipe comes down, and then I'm painting out Count Dooku entirely and just adding back a little bit of noise to hide that. And then I'm taking a freeze frame from the same place. I'm taking a freeze frame of Count Dooku and just very loosely animating him to sort of walk away. So, you know, I'm moving the position and scale and having him sort of do some weird little steps. And then to sort of sell all that a little better, I'm doing a liquefy effect to sort of have him rotate his head around and sort of shift a little, so it's not just obviously a 2D card moving around. And again, because this is a freeze frame, I'm adding just a tiny bit of noise onto the top of there just to blend that in. So we end up with this ridiculous looking little trip off into the distance, but it does sort of just give me enough to hide behind this wipe. Boom. Cool.